Welcome to a ride on the outside. MMA is full of people on the inside. But what about the ones that watch from beyond? Welcome to the MMA Outsiders with Tom Albano and Zain Bando on the Empty the Bench Podcast Network.
It's another edition of the MMA Outsiders. A little later in the week, but better late than never. That's Zain. I'm Tom. Zain, here we are. International Fight Week weekend. It is time for the most hyped UFC card that it seems to happen. That happens every year. They put so much promotion behind this. Obviously, you wish it would be a big name like a John Jones, a Conor McGregor, even a Brock Lesnar, somebody fighting in the main event of UFC 290 International Fight Week. But we've got a high intense undisputed featherweight title fight. We've got, I think, very interesting story when it comes to Moreno Pantoja 2 for the flyweight strap. We've got a title eliminator featuring a fan favorite and the biggest up-and-comer in the sport, I would say. And then, of course, the retirement of an MMA legend. All that plus a Hall of Fame class, plus a whole bunch of other stories that we got to get to with the UFC world and the boxing world. Just an absolutely stacked week that we've got to talk about this week. Before we get on with any of the rest of the show, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you get notified of everything here at the Empty the Bench Network, including every edition of the MMA Outsiders and all the specials that we do, whether it be post shows for pay-per-views, tough enoughs, and more. Make sure to follow us across social media at MMA Outsiders ETB and follow the Empty the Bench Network at ETB Network across social media. That is Zain Bando to my right. My co-host, as always, follow him at Zambado99. He is a staff writer over at bjpen.com, and bjpen.com will come up a couple of times in the stories of this episode, so make sure to check them out. Zain, also a member of the Bellator Rankings Committee. I am Tom Albano. You can find my work over at Fansided MMA. I am usually contributing to every UFC card, especially come pay-per-view time. I'll have a lot coming out this week for UFC 290. Some stories actually making their way before UFC 290 in the week. I actually just dropped very recently a story I did based around Aaron McKenzie from Tough, an interview he did with my editor and your former editor, and Amy Kaplan. Pretty interesting tidbits, which I'll actually get a little bit into when we come to a Tough story. Follow me at Thomas J. Albano. You can also find my work over at the PFL for every card for the PFL for the rest of the 2023 season, including PFL Europe 2, which also takes place on Saturday. So, Zain, I'm going to be morning through night just covering fights, and I'm going to be pretty tired. But obviously, PFL Europe 2 not airing in the United States. So, those of you in the U.S. who want to get your dosage of PFL, happenings over at the PFL Europe 2, I'm your guy. I'll have you for all that on the PFL website. All right, enough. I need to get you in here, Zain, because we got a lot we got to get through and a little bit of a change to the format with this week's episode.
Yeah, for those of you who know us well and have watched us for almost a year now, I can't believe I'm even saying that we're coming up on almost a year of doing the show. Thank you to Tom for making this all happen a year ago when it did come around. But based on the format of this show and what we usually do, where we always start with the news first and then we get into the reviews and previews, if you will, we decided that UFC 290 had a little bit of extra special meaning. And with it being International Fight Week, we are going to lead with covering UFC 290 to begin the show and then move into all of our news items that we were just briefly discussing in the intro just a second ago. So a little bit of a change in format. We hope this doesn't become a regular thing, but we will give the larger cards and the cards that have a little bit more beef to them more priority. So that is the reason for the change there.
Yeah, and obviously there's quite a bit of the happenings going on, outside of International Fight Week and in the boxing world. But I mean, the reason everyone is hyped this week, the reason everybody seems to be talking this week, yeah, you just had a Tough episode that just had an interesting in-cage incident at the UFC Apex. But most of the conversation in the mixed martial arts world this week does revolve around the UFC with their card on Saturday, UFC 290. And Zan, let's just get right into it. The main event, as I alluded to just before, the undisputed UFC Featherweight Championship. You've got Alexander Volkanovski taking on Yair Rodriguez. Volk has been champion since winning the title from Max Holloway in December of 2019. He's defended it against Holloway twice. He's defended it against Korean Zombie. He is coming off of his first loss, Zan, in which he actually, no, I think it's his first loss since his professional MMA debut. It was very early in his debut. He challenged Islam Makhachev for the UFC Lightweight Championship during Super Bowl weekend, put on a hell of a display, ultimately coming up short on the scorecards. Some might even say controversially, because Volk, I mean, his stock definitely, I think, Zan, this is one of those rare cases where his stock actually went up after a loss, in spite of the loss, instead of going down. I mean, it was number 1 versus number 2 in the pound for pound rankings. And now, Zan, he is taking on Yair Rodriguez, the co-main event of that card where Volk fought Islam. They wanted to make sure they would have something in line for featherweight afterwards, regardless of what happened with Volk and Islam. So Yair Rodriguez fought Josh Emmett, and Yair Rodriguez was able to have a pretty nice handle and quickly finish Josh Emmett to become the interim featherweight champion. And now we've got Volk versus Yair. And Zan, I remember a couple months ago when the reports were that Jones Stipe was not going to happen on this card. I said, then the UFC better have something ready, and Volk versus Yair better be fight of the year. And Zan, considering the talent that both Volkanovski and Yair have, there is definitely a good chance that they could live up to that hype, because I see this one being a strike fest. I see these two putting a battering on one another.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is a very high level fight. Volkanovski, obviously, as you just alluded to, fought Islam Makhachev to the brink. You could argue that he might have won that fight, and then of course, Yair Rodriguez has been one of the best featherweights in the world for several years, and is looking to continue that Mexican trajectory of becoming yet another undisputed Mexican champion. It's crazy to see that entire country just rise up and produce contender and champion after contender and champion, et cetera, et cetera. So it's nice to see him back in this position again. And you want to talk about a high-level featherweight title fight, I think you can make the argument holistically that this is the biggest undisputed UFC featherweight title fight since Jose Aldo fought Conor McGregor, and I don't even think it's even close.
Yeah, I don't think it. As much as I love Max Holloway, I don't think Aldo Holloway even had this kind of hype. This is, I mean, you're giving them the International Fight Week stage for this. Like, this is going to be, this should be absolutely incredible. And so you've got Holloway, I mean, you've got Volkanovski, who we've seen his striking be completely on point. He's got some great power. He and the rest of the City Kickboxing team. I mean, Zan, how often do we talk about the City Kickboxing team? The athletes from that gym just being absolutely dominant with him, with Adesanya, Kai Kara France. Like that is, I think, and Zandy, honestly, you could argue that Alex Volkanovski could be the most talented out of that bunch.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, that's a gym that's been on the rise for several years now, and I think it's starting to slowly come into its own in probably the last 1 to 2 years. And Volkanovski is, without a doubt, the spearhead of it. But what I like about this fight is the volume. So let's take a look and let's do a bit of a deeper dive. You want to talk about someone who has some of the most high level boxing in all of MMA. You look no further than Alexander Volkanovski. You want to talk about someone who's got some of the nastiest power at 145, and someone who can viciously finish someone in a couple minutes. You look at someone like a Yair Rodriguez, what he was able to do to Josh Emmett, one of the toughest guys at 145, a guy that took a literal beating against Ilia Topuria just a couple weeks ago in Jacksonville. still withstood it and was still trying to win the fight in the 5th round. I think it just goes to show how technical and how talented Yair Rodriguez is, because if he can do that to Josh Emmett, and you've seen what Alexander Volkanovski can do to the likes of Max Holloway, who's arguably the greatest featherweight ever, and what he was able to nearly do to Islam Makhachev, which is beat probably the biggest Dagestanian superstar since Khabib Nurmagomedov. You want to talk about the high level strength of schedule and the common opponents that these two share against each other. You can't get a more high level fight than this. And you want to talk about a hardcore fight. This is definitely one of those fights. And again, as you just alluded to, I don't see how this doesn't live up to the billing. And without a doubt, I think if the fight goes the way we think it's going to go, you could easily see these guys rematch down the line 100%. And I think you could easily see a situation where no matter who wins this fight, it puts Max Holloway in a position to where if he doesn't beat Korean Zombie, he's never going to get another shot at his former featherweight title ever again. So this fight is huge, not just for the two guys fighting in the main event, but for the entire top 5. These guys are going to be watching on pins and needles to see what happens, especially Ilia Topuria with his last performance. And then, of course, one other thing I'd like to mention, Alexander Volkanovski has been in this position before. He fought on International Fight Week at UFC 276, so he knows exactly what this position is like. Yair Rodriguez does not. He's obviously fought in an interim title fight before, but he has not fought against the guy in a fight of this magnitude. So it's going to be very interesting. And I think the pressure is more so on Rodriguez to see how he performs versus Volkanovski to go out and execute, because we know Volkanovski will go out and execute. It's just a matter of how the fight will actually play out. But one thing you can guarantee is that this fight will not be boring. That's for sure.
For sure. One thing, by the way, Zan, I'm actually on the UFC stats page. And just listen to this, because talk about the boxing of Alex Volkanovski and even Yair Rodriguez's striking. So Alex Volkanovski, significant strikes landed per minute, 6.35. 56% striking accuracy. Yair Rodriguez, 4.78 significant strikes per minute, 46% striking accuracy. One thing to note, Zan, by the way, with the stats, that I'm kind of curious to see how this plays out. Now, both of these guys, the stats according to the UFC, they both have a 71-inch reach. But what's going to be interesting is Volkanovski is going to be the shorter man by quite a bit. Volk is only 5'6". Yair Rodriguez, 5'11". And Zan, I just want to talk about Yair Rodriguez for a second, because honestly, over the last 5 or 6 years, there have been fewer people who have had, quite the road from, decency and or maybe not living up to the hype to all of a sudden getting this kind of run. Obviously, Yair Rodriguez, he won the Ultimate Fighter Latin America season, but it was just 2017, Zan, where Yair Rodriguez had lost to Frankie Edgar. And there was some things that happened between him and the UFC where it was maybe a period of about a week or so where Yair Rodriguez got cut by the UFC after a little falling out with Dana White before the two talk things out. And honestly, Zan, ever since then, because then his follow-up fight, he fought Korean Zombie, and that was the famous back elbow literal last second comeback knockout at the 25th anniversary show.
Absolutely. Which, by the way, I have a bold take on that. Let's say Rodriguez had remained cut from the UFC. I think you could make the sole argument that Alexander Volkanovski would either be retired or would be a double champion, because that's how talented Rodriguez was going to become at the time. No one just knew it. No one knew it quite yet.
Ooh, wow. I mean, Zan, he lived up to that billing, because then the next year, he has the no contest with Jeremy Stevens. That's rematched, and he gets winning that rematch. Doesn't fight for a while, but part of that ends up being, COVID, so he doesn't fight for 2 years. He faces Max Holloway, and despite the loss to Max Holloway, he took everything that Holloway had, and he basically delivered to the point where Zain, obviously we haven't seen anybody beat Max Holloway at featherweight other than Alex Volkanovski. But Yair Rodriguez actually made us in that November 2021 fight question, if Holloway was still the fighter that he was, because he landed some decent shots on Holloway and he made it a competitive bout.
He did, especially because wasn't that a 5-round main
Yeah,
event?
that was a 5-round UFC Fight Night main event. Yeah,
I think I can recall in round 3. Obviously, we didn't watch the fight together, but I can recall. In round 3. I think MMA Twitter had a similar sentiment that maybe Max Holloway, like you said, it wasn't the same, and it could have arguably been finished in round 3 or round 4. But the fight obviously was, and was it a 4th round stoppage or did it go the distance?
It went the distance.
Okay, I figured as much, but yeah, I mean, it was still a very competitive fight, and I think it just goes to show how much better Rodriguez has gotten since then. And I think it was just only a matter of time before he was going to get a title fight. It was just a matter of when, and obviously here he is. And yeah, I mean, you want to talk about fighting the baddest dude on the planet right now, not named John Jones, the UFC heavyweight champion. I think Alexander Volkanovski is probably that guy. And you want to talk about one of the highest level UFC fights you'll see all year. I think they're looking at it, and I think they're looking at a scenario where, if Volkanovski wins this fight, the question more so becomes, outside of Ilia Topuria, I mean, who would Volkanovski have left to fight? He's literally cleaned out 145. And if you look at Yair Rodriguez, the question becomes, okay, do you do an immediate rematch? And then, of course, the second layer to that is, obviously, if he wins it, like, refreshes the division again. There's a couple of rematches in there, but for the most part, it's a clean slate. So overall, no matter which way you look at it, it's a positive outcome either way, regardless of which guy wins.
And then, honestly, if Volk wins and Holloway beats Korean Zombie, if Dana and the matchmakers think Ilia Topuria still needs another fight before a title shot, who knows? Maybe they do. We talked about it a few weeks ago when the Topuria fight out. Maybe they run Volk Holloway 4 anyway, even though Volk won all 3 fights.
I mean, I think you could argue the second fight was, I think you could argue the second fight was close to warrant a third fight, which happened. And then the third fight had so much hype around it that even though it wasn't close, I think this is, again, one of those rare instances where the first 2 fights were so close that doing a fourth one, I wouldn't be opposed to it.
But moving on to focusing on just this fight, I mean, you got Alexander Volkanovski, who, like we mentioned, one of the best, if not the best talent out there from City Kickboxing, taking on Yair Rodriguez, who has a kickboxing base. Although, Sam, we have seen both these guys go to the ground when need be. Obviously, Alexander Volkanovski, you think of the fight with Brian Ortega, which was a featherweight classic, where Ortega has him in a choke and it looks like Volk might go out, and Volkanovski somehow was able to power out of it and keep a hold on Rodriguez, on Ortega, and have his way with him till the final horn. And then for Yair Rodriguez, obviously submitting Josh Emmett to win the interim championship. So honestly, these two are completely talented. My questions are with Volkanovski. Number one, as I mentioned before, 5-inch height disadvantage. How is he going to? Obviously, we've seen Volkanovski before be the shorter man, but 5-inch height disadvantage against the featherweight like Rodriguez. How is that going to play out? Number two, especially with the striking versus striking battle, I should say. And number two, Yair Rodriguez, Alexander Volkanovski. It's a question of who has the bigger experience, because Alexander Volkanovski, Islam Makhachev is a tough son of a gun, and Yair Rodriguez, at least to my knowledge, hasn't done the move up, hasn't competed at another weight class. Alexander Volkanovski, obviously, we just mentioned, coming off of a fight at lightweight, but Alexander Volkanovski, three of his last 5 opponents has been the same guy, as we kind of alluded to, in Max Holloway,
Right.
and Zombies. So, and then previously before that, facing Jose Aldo, facing Chad Mendes, although you could argue that Mendes and Aldo were kind of past their MMA prime. I say MMA prime because Jose Aldo obviously is now killing it so far with his pro boxing run. But Yair Rodriguez taking on Josh Emmett, taking on Jeremy Stevens, Frankie Edgar, Korean Zombie, Brian Ortega, even though that fight ended short because of the shoulder injury for Ortega. But my question is the fact that Yair Rodriguez over his last 5, 6, 7 fights having bigger variety of competition, does that benefit him more than Alexander Volkanovski, who has faced the top of the top with Max Holloway and Islam Makhachev, but like we said, Holloway he's had the trilogy against, so he hasn't had the same variety as Yair has. Who has the better experience factor leading into this fight?
I'd say Volk. I mean, you want to look at it. I mean, even though he's fought Max Holloway in 3 out of his last 4 fights, you look at the level of competition Volk has fought. I think championship experience is championship experience, which is something that Rodriguez doesn't even have half of. So I think the argument is pretty simple, and I think, in this scenario, you have to go with the guy that's been the featherweight champ for almost 4 years. And I guess the only argument you can make for Rodriguez is the fact that he's looked better the last couple of years, and the competition he's faced has been stiffer. And yes, he does have the height advantage, but the fact of the matter is that Volk is the undisputed champ for a reason. And he's fought the best fighters in the world to get to where he is. And I'm not saying Volk hasn't, he just doesn't have the same level of champ. Or I'm not saying Rodriguez hasn't. I'm just saying that he doesn't have the same level of championship experience that Volkanovski does, and that's why I would side with the champ for that argument.
Zain, you kind of took the words out of my mouth. That honestly, I am going to side with Volkanovski retaining his title, retaining the undisputed featherweight championship for a reason, and that is, I think he has fought Max Holloway 3 times, and despite the lack of the variety, Zain, how much do we talk about Max Holloway along with another guy we're going to talk about with Robert Whitaker being the quadruple A section of fighters, and that the only guys that they seem to lose to are to the champion. In Holloway's case here is to Volkanovski.
Mm-hmm.
And Rodriguez, he has faced Max Holloway before, and despite the fact that we kind of questioned if Holloway was still the same fighter, Holloway still got the job done. Yair Rodriguez, Josh Emmett's had his shot before, even before their interim title fight, and he couldn't get the job done. Yeah, Alexander Volkanovski is going to be a different kind of challenge for Yair Rodriguez. I think it's going to be a fun striking battle, a fun kickboxing battle. But like you said, Alexander Volkanovski is the champ for a reason. I think the fact that even though he lost, the fact that he went up and fought Islam Makhachev and gave him a run for his money and nearly won the lightweight title does him absolutely more favors. I think even if Yair Rodriguez decides to take the fight to the ground, I think Volkanovski, from that experience with the Islam fight, is going to be more than ready for that. I think he definitely has the better kickboxing. I think he has, specifically, I should say, the better power when it comes to kickboxing. I don't know if Yair is going to be ready for that power in spite of having the size advantage. So I don't think I don't think Volk's going to have enough to finish Yair. I think Yair is too tough. But I think the experience factor and the power factor are going to weigh more in Volkanovski's favor. It's going to be too much for Rodriguez to overcome. I'm going to say Volk by unanimous decision retains the title.
Okay, I'm going to say Volk by 4th round stoppage, but I could see this also being a Volk decision, as his fights usually are. And that's not to say that Volkanovski's fights aren't boring. His fights are master classes, but I just feel like with Yair's conditioning, number 1, his height advantage, number 2, and him, probably wanting to go in there the first 2 rounds and do everything he can to finish him, there's no way this doesn't go into deep water. And I'm kind of with you on the same wavelength there. I do think this is a longer fight, and I think Volkanovski gets it done. I have to ask you this because it just popped into my head, and we've been referencing him a ton so far in previewing this main event. If you were a Max Holloway, who are you rooting for, and what is your most desirable outcome, considering that you are a spectator this weekend and you are not competing, given your number 1 contendership status and your fight coming up in Singapore in about a month or so.
Zen, if you had asked me this question last week or a couple of weeks ago, I probably would have said Volkanovski because of what we talked about, the easy path, an easier path to a 4 fight, in spite of the fact that it's been a fairly, for the most part, one-sided feud between him and Volk. The thing is, Yair Rodriguez, as you mentioned, could really freshen up this division, and Holloway has been Yair before. The wild cards and in all of this, we kind of alluded to, though, is going to be Ilia Topuria, and well, how do the UFC and matchmakers feel about him after facing Josh Emmett? Do they think that? Yeah, I mean, also, I guess I could throw a question right back at you. How do you think the UFC matchmakers and Dana, what are they thinking about Ilia? Do you think that they're going to give Ilia a title shot ASAP?
Well, I think it depends on how the Korean Zombie Max Holloway fight plays out. Here's the scenario that I have for you of how I think they're going to approach it. I
Okay.
think if Holloway wins, they'll give it to Poirier a #1 contender fight, and they'll give him Holloway coming off of the win against Korean Zombie. If Korean Zombie somehow wins the Holloway fight,
And it's got to be
goes off-
Topuria at that
yeah,
point.
it has to be to Poirier getting the next title shot. Yeah.
I think so. I think the only way Topuria doesn't get the title shot in that case, Stan, is obviously if Volk doesn't win here. If Yair Rodriguez pulls off the victory, you kind of alluded to before, obviously they're going to have to do a rematch at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, you would just have to give Topuria a #1 contenders fight. And honestly, if Holloway finishes Zombie in the first rounds, like I think it could probably happen, and the UFC ultimately doesn't want to go in a rematch direction here, especially if Volk retains, I think honestly, just based on my reaction before, I think Holloway Topuria #1 contenders fight just makes the most sense.
Yeah. So I think in almost 3 out of the 4 scenarios we presented, the likely outcome is going to be Holloway versus Topuria for a #1 contendership at some point later this year or early next year. But nonetheless, in order for all of this to really happen, Volkanovski would more than likely need to win this fight to get all of these wheels in motion. So there you go. That's a comprehensive breakdown of the main event. Again, 5-round unification bout. Volkanovski versus Rodriguez to headline UFC 290. It isn't the only title fight that we have on this card, however, because in the co-main event for the flyweight championship, we have a long-awaited rematch from several years ago for Brandon Moreno versus Alexandre Pantoja 2. And honestly, Tom, I think this fight snuck up on us. How about you?
So, Zan, just doing some research on this fight, I think this has a more interesting storyline than the featherweight championship, as I think the featherweight championship fight's the more exciting fight, but just the story stake is right here. And I don't know if you and I are going to be on the same wavelength. I don't know how much digging you did on this, but Brandon Moreno versus Alex, this is actually going to be their third fight. The first time they fought didn't count because it was on top. It was on the special flyweight season.
That's right.
It was on the special flyweight season of The Ultimate Fighter, where all the flyweight champions of the regional scenes fought to determine who would face Mighty Mouse Johnson. And
crazy. I remember that. Yeah.
And Alex Pantoja won that first fight. And then they would have their rematch later. I'm actually kind of curious, though, Zan. I want to see that tough season because they were both flyweight champions of regional promotions. I want to just double check here. So Alex Pantoja, what championship did he hold? He held he was the RFA flyweight champion and then became the Axis TV flyweight super fight champion because that was when Axis used to air both the Legacy Fighting Championship and the RFA before they merged.
Yeah, that is for those of you who just started tuning into the sport. That is a long time ago. Tom, UFC going back like 8 or 9 years ago, right?
Yeah, and Brandon Moreno was the WFF flyweight champion. But the one fight they did have that did count was in May of 2018. and Pantoja got the win by unanimous decision. And then Zain, months later, Brandon Moreno would be cut from the UFC. And that's when he infamously posted that footage to social media where he revealed he had been cut and basically flat out said the plan was for the UFC to kill the flyweight division after Mighty Mouse got traded in. We thought the death blow was going to be TJ Dillashaw beating Henry Cejudo in January of 19 at the first ESPN Plus card. Obviously, Zan, Henry Cejudo kind of changed those plans. He went
Yeah,
to
yeah,
finish.
he sure did.
And Brandon Moreno, I have to say, Zan, had one of the best kind of comeback runs alongside Jair Rodriguez, who we talked about before, because he goes over to the LFA for a fight, wins their flyweight championship, then gets re-signed to the UFC, and his only loss since then, Zan, has been to Davison Figueiredo in their third fight, and he fought Figueiredo to a draw. He also before that fought Askar Askarov to a draw. And Brandon Moreno has just been one of the most feel-good stories of the UFC since 2020.
For sure. And by the way, speaking of Moreno, Figgy won. Their first fight is a fight that I thought Moreno won before they announced it was a draw.
I kind of did too. I was thinking that Moreno might have won, if only, Zan, for the fact that Figueiredo had gotten deducted a point during that first fight.
That is exactly right. And that was during the height of COVID, where you had UFC pay-per-view main events in the Apex. That was actually one of the last title fights you would ever see at the Apex before they officially made it a fight night exclusive home, which is kind of weird. To think about.
And Zen, it still goes to this very day.
That's exactly Apex. Absolutely, and it probably will go on for as long as the UFC ceases to exist. I would think.
Let's talk about this fight, though, Zane. Let's talk about more positive things. So, obviously, Pantoja has had the better of Moreno, although Moreno has, like we said, has had the run, that he's had. That he's only had one loss since Pantoja beat him that time in May of 2018. And San, I would definitely, it sounds so obvious to say that they are two different fighters since that 2018 fight. But I think Moreno, it's not just that he's a different fighter, but I think Moreno has grown levels. And I would even argue levels that might be above Pantoja at this point.
Yeah, he's certainly a level above Pantoja. The question is what is Brandon Moreno going to do differently that he wasn't able to execute in the first fight? I think that's the big question coming into this rematch that everyone needs to be aware of, because if Pantoja can do what he did to him in the first fight, which is tire him out and win a decision, it could be very similar. Granted, that fight was 3 rounds. This is a different beast in a 5-round fight.
Yeah, and that's the thing, Zan. I know Pantoja, you're right, has exhausted Moreno before, but I think Brandon Moreno, has looked different over his last several fights. I mean, the quadrilogy with Figgy, I think that, he made it to the bell all 5 times, and they were all close fights except for the 2. I mean, the 2 fights that went to decisions were close, and then the other 2 times he managed to get a finish of Figgy. So I feel like Brandon Moreno, that's why I say that Brandon Moreno has grown in this, in that, he goes from being tired in a 3-round fight to changing things up and doing a good job of conserving energy as he gets ready for these 5-round encounters. Pantoja, it's only flyweight, and we talked about men's flyweight not being a main event until very recently. So Pantoja, when was the last time he got ready for a 5-round fight? I'd have to look that up here. Because the UFC, like we said, hasn't really had flyweight main events, at least on the men's side, in a long while. So I would have to assume that he hasn't gone ready for a 5-round fight since The last time Zain he went the decision in a 5-round fight is never. He's gone to the decision in 3-round fights, but the 5-round fights that he's fought, Alexander Pantoja has gotten finishes. So I'm really curious even more to see what would happen if this fight goes into the championship rounds, like I think it will.
Very, very interesting. All right. Well, I'm gonna give you my prediction, and I'm gonna say that this is the chance to be another potential fight of the year candidate. I think Moreno ekes out a split decision, but actually, I do think one of the judges is going to score 47-47. So I do think it will be a majority decision for Brandon Moreno, but I think it'll be very close to where we could get into some sort of draw discussions, and there could be a ton of controversy just given who these guys have fought, given how similar their styles are. And I just think it's got a weird, murky feeling in the air. And do not be surprised if there's a lot of question marks after this fight is over.
You're going very specific here, going with the majority decision. I kind of like it. I think Brandon Moreno is going to take it. I'm not going to go as specific as you. I am going to go specific though. I'm going to go similar wavelength, but not the same. Moreno in a split decision.
Okay.
And I would argue, Zain, if we're confident that Volk's going to get the job done, then with the UFC and Dana's mission of trying to get to the Mexican fan base, him admitting a few months ago, basically, that he and the UFC were effing up, trying to get that hold of a Mexican fan base, and they're trying to make up for it, say, with the September 16th card with Grasso Shevchenko. But considering all that, and considering what we just said with being confident Volk beats Yair, if that's all the case, then this is a must-win. If from the perspective of the UFC, from Brandon Moreno.
Agreed. So, with that being said, if Moreno wins this fight, is it too quick to assume that they could turn him around for Mexican Independence Day to defend his title again, or what do you think?
If it's as close as we think it's going to be, Zain, then you would have to assume some third fight is going to happen. And I don't know if you quickly turn them around on such short notice, because that would only give them a couple of months to get ready, which is plausible. But I don't know. You got to take into consideration, are any of these guys going to be, suspended? What's the word? Medically suspended by the commissions. How much damage are these two going to take in the fight, especially Moreno? I don't know. I could see him being there, like in the crowd and during like any festivities beforehand. I don't know if he fights on that card. I think, Zain, the only way Grasso Shevchenko 2 does not main event, and these two guys somehow make the quick turnaround and do main event Mexican Independence Day, is if there's some controversial early finish, like a submission being botched, like one of them has a submission on the other, the referee thinks they're out and they're not. That's the only, and it's early in the fight. That's the only way I see that happening.
Without a doubt, but I think it would. I think if a trilogy were to happen on Mexican Independence Day, it would make for the biggest UFC fight night card ever.
So then you better pray for some early controversial BS finish at this point.
Yeah. Given where I hope to be, that yeah, absolutely.
And you're trying. And I know you're trying to talk it into existence.
No, I am, but nonetheless, I don't see any controversy really happening outside of the fact that I do think one of the judges is going to score a draw. But nonetheless, I do think they will get the decision correct, and I do think Moreno wins. But then again, you're going to have to do a trilogy at some point anyway, because it's 1-1. So you never know. You could see that take place either at UFC 298 or 299, or heck, even putting it on UFC 300 for a potential trilogy between these two sounds like a fun idea also. So you never know.
All right. Let's move on now, Zain, out of the championship fights. Well, let's stay with championship, but we're not a title fight. It's a title eliminator. It's a number one contenders fight. I don't know. Do you prefer the term title eliminator or number one contenders fight? Because I always like number one contenders fight.
Number one contenders fight for sure.
So it's Robert Whittaker, the former middleweight champion, the beloved former middleweight champion, taking on Dricus du Plessis. Yes, you hear it, Zen. The train is in the background. And Dricus du Plessis is in the biggest opportunity, the biggest fight in his mixed martial arts career. Bigger than EFC Africa, bigger than his KSW title fight. We are finally here, and he is going to face Robert Whittaker for the chance to face who we assume is Israel Adesanya. I mean, there's all this back and forth, Zan. I mean, the assumption, Zan, I'm going to say the assumption, because we just talked about, with Moreno and Pantoja, if 2 months is a quick turnaround. The assumption is the winner of this fight is going to have to try and make 2 months turnaround to face Adesanya in Sydney in September.
Yeah. Well, first off, I know where you're going with this fight.
And your mission right now is to talk me out of it. I'm going to say that right now.
Okay. I mean, I guess the simplest way for me to talk you out of it is we're talking about the former UFC middleweight champion. That's again the triple A to the UFC middleweight champion, which is Israel Adesanya. Robert Whittaker can beat everybody else except for the champion. Dricus du Plessis is the hottest middleweight prospect in years. Don't get me wrong, he has a legitimate chance to finish Whittaker. Heck, he might even have a legitimate chance to knock Whittaker out. Is he gonna
help me out?
Is he gonna do it? I don't think so, because I think Robert Whittaker's wrestling is going to overtake du Plessis, and I think he will win a decision, but it will definitely be a fight that I think a lot of people will be excited about after it's over. And I know there are a lot of DDP haters out there. I'm not one of them. And I think his time will come eventually, just not right now, given where Robert Whittaker is in his career. Although, if you are the UFC and you want to keep your dream of UFC Africa alive, you are praying that DDP somehow wins this fight.
Which, Sad, I mean, I was going to say, if you're the UFC, you might have to pray that DDP wins so you don't have to do Adesanya Whittaker 3. But that's a conversation that part of that stretches to the fact that middleweight, I mean, Adesanya's kind of just run through everybody except these young up-and-comers like a DDP. The issue that I have, San, is the fact that the both points that we just said, you said, well, they're going to want, if they want to keep their dream of UFC Africa alive for that to happen. But think about what I just said. That they might quickly want him to turn around so he can defend in Sydney. Now, granted, Israel Adesanya represents New Zealand, but that's the thing. Like, I know they're going to want that fight to come off quickly, but you know, the UFC is doing itself no favors. I'll just say it right now. The UFC is going to do itself no favors if it tries to book Adesanya DDP for Australia for Sydney in September.
I don't think they could. I don't think they could.
At that point, if DDP pulls off the win, immediately you have to pull Adesanya from Australia and you have to put something else there, because at that point, then you have to do UFC Africa with Adesanya and du Plessis. Now, if Whittaker wins and he's able to, and he gives the okay for a quick turnaround, then yeah, you can run Adesanya Whittaker 3 in Sydney. But if DDP wins, you have to change the plans.
But then you're which Tom, I know you're gonna hate this, but I think if you're the UFC, the only choice you have if DDP wins is to do Jones versus Sergey in Australia, and you're stuck in a scenario where you don't have a main event for Madison Square Garden.
Or you don't have a main event for UFC Australia at this point. Yeah, you're kind of, the UFC kind of, let's just put it this, the UFC effed itself by booking a Sydney in September.
They did.
100%.
100%.
They should have just waited for the start of 24. No disrespect to all of you out there in Australia and New Zealand, but they should have just waited for the start of 24 to do Sydney again. September, they could have put anywhere else. They could have put in Arizona. They could have put in Florida again. They could have put
it in Chicago.
You know where I was going with that one.
They could have put it in Chicago
And
because he has experience fighting there. I was there when he fought Yoel Romero.
And they effed it up. They effed it up by putting it in Sydney now. So I will say this. As much as I'm on the hype train, the one thing I am very concerned about that Zain is no secret to even the most casual of fans who have seen DDP is we know what his strategy is. He tries to lay all his energy out and go for the finish very early to the point where rounds 2 through whatever, in this case 3, he is tired. And I'm worried that somebody like Whitaker might, like you kind of said, grapple him, might take him out, it might hold him down just because that Du Plessis is so tired, let alone the fact that Whitaker is great with his wrestling.
Yeah, and again, another thing you mentioned, I think something that DDP needs to worry about strategically is, even though this isn't a 5-round fight, he needs to treat it like a 5-round fight because he knows that this is the warm-up appetizer to a potential championship fight later this year, early next year. And if he goes in underestimating how good Robert Whitaker still is, despite him only losing to Israel Adesanya in the last 4 years, that's going to smell bad news. And going back to your other point of him trying to exert his energy early in the fight, that is something you can't do against Robert Whitaker, because Robert Whitaker is just going to smother you, take you to the ground, and try to finish you there, or hold you and try to win a decision. So those two things are things that he needs to look out for. And if those things can't be executed, he's in for a very difficult night.
So here's what I'm going to say.
Okay.
My brain is going to go with Whitaker.
Okay.
But damn it, Dan, I will not lie to you if I'm not saying that. I would lie to you if I didn't say I'm kind of rooting for a first or early second round finish by Du Plessis. I will be going nuts if that happens.
But will you also be really nervous because then their Australia plans are up in smoke?
See, Zain, the problem with what you argued with before about then you have no choice but to do Jones Pavlovich. Zain, I don't know if Jones is interested in Pavlovich. I think Jones only wants to do Stipe.
Interesting, because it looks like Sergey still wants Jones. Every single photo that he's posting.
Oh, that's obvious, Zain. That's the obvious part. Pavlovich wants Jones, but is Jones okay with that fight? Because it seems like everything with Jones in the last few months, when we talk about fight news, it's Stipe this and Stipe that and Stipe.
Good point. Well, you might have to get into a situation where contract talks are going to stall, and they're going to have to keep the heavyweight division moving at some point. I mean,
Zain,
Tom, at this point, okay, go ahead.
Actually, you know what? Go on your point then. Go on your point.
I was just going to say, what are we in? Early July. We're a couple days after the 4th of July, and we still don't know what the heck is going on with contract negotiations between Jones and Miocic. It's mind-boggling to me.
So you're not going to like what I'm going to say then, but you wouldn't be surprised at this point. Considering we have no news about Leon and Colby, considering what we just talked about with Du Plessis, if Du Plessis wins,
okay,
and they decide, we have to scrap plans to try to do UFC Africa, do Dana and matchmakers go to Dana and investors, everybody's best friend, and say, Sydney, you get interim championship fight?
I mean, knowing the UFC at this point, knowing that they're willing to move events, knowing that they're trying to make Elon Musk versus Mark Zuckerberg, anything is possible.
Or do they try to book Zuck versus Musk for Sydney on September 9th?
No, I think if they're going to do Musk versus Zuckerberg, we're going to try to save it for UFC 300.
Unless they book it for Madison Square Garden.
That would be the biggest FU in the entire MMA fan base ever.
Or December at the T-Mobile.
Or December. Jeez.
Merry Christmas, Dana White. Dana Claus gives you coal.
No kidding.
He thinks it's a present. We think it's a present, but it's actually the present is the biggest lump of coal to ever grace the sport of mixed martial arts.
No kidding. And you're not wrong in your assessment there. In fact, you're dead on. Hey, and it would be the most hilarious comedic MMA moment probably in the last like 10 to 15 years if that were to happen.
So my take, just to wrap up this fight, my take is the UFC has placed itself in a lose-lose situation. Either you got to run another middleweight rematch and then figure out afterwards what the hell you got to do with Israel Adesanya because he's run through this division, or you got to figure out what the hell you're going to do in Sydney. If you're willing to risk losing UFC Africa for the sake of, I mean, let me actually be more specific. Lose the biggest chance that you have of UFC Africa if you want to go ahead and quickly book Adesanya versus Duplessis in September. So I'll laugh and cheer if Duplessis gets the finish, but UFC go UFC and screw itself out of situations.
1000%.
All right, let's talk about the rest of the main card. You got Jalen Turner versus Dan Hooker. Biggest opportunity for Jalen Turner at this point.
Oh, without a doubt, and I think a must-win situation for Dan Hooker if he wants to stay in that title picture.
Yeah,
the UFC is probably, to me, it seems that the UFC is building Jalen Turner as a stepping stone, which he is not. But at the same time, if Dan Hooker loses this fight, he's been on a horrible run since the beginning of 2021. What, he's only won one or two fights in the last 2.5 years? That's not a good look.
Probably. So to clarify, Jalen Turner's number 11, Dan Hooker's number 12. Zain, do you remember when that fight that you mentioned about early 21, Chandler's UFC debut, and Hooker was a top 5 lightweight? Like,
I do remember that.
Fallen. So what I was going to say, Zain, was that basically this is a fight where Turner has everything to gain and Dan Hooker has everything to lose. So is this a situation where Hooker, with his back to the wall, is going to come out and be absolutely dangerous? But you look at Jalen Turner, his run. I mean, he's coming off a split decision loss to Mateusz Gamrot. But before that, Brad Riddell, Jamie Malarkey, Earls Medic. And Gamrot, like we said, split decision, close fight. I think he's still at, let's face it, he's got Dan Hooker. This is such a huge opportunity for him. But I was looking for Dan Hooker's run. So he's won 2 fights. He's 2 and 3.
I was right.
So
I was right. Yeah.
So actually, if you want to stretch it further, 2 and 4 since COVID era took over, because he lost to Poirier. He went up 2 rounds on Poirier and infamously blew the 2-0 lead. Lost to Chandler, beat Nasrat Haqparast, lost to Islam Makhachev, lost to Arnold Allen, and in November at the Garden he finished Claudio Puelles.
Mm-hmm.
So
didn't it just lose to Arnold Allen? Got absolutely decimated by Arnold Allen in London.
Now, granted, Arnold Allen is another name, is another up and coming name when it comes to the UFC's top prospects at this point. But I mean, if you're Dan Hooker, if you lose to Jalen Turner, there's a very good chance you're falling out. You would either fall to 14 or 15. Or he would completely fall out of the lightweight rankings 100%.
Oh, I think he would fall out of the lightweight rankings with a loss like this. I personally.
So, but do you think it's going to? Or do you think maybe Hooker is going to be a little more motivated with this fight? Because, like you said, I think the UFC is setting up as this a little comeback fight, but...
Oh, I mean, I'm thinking...
No, sorry, Zain. I was pausing for dramatic effect. I'm sorry.
Okay.
But slight hot take. I think the UFC is going to be surprised, and Jalen Turner finishes Dan Hooker in the second round.
Oh, I don't agree with that for a second. I think this is a must-win for Dan Hooker, and I actually think he stops Jalen Turner in the first round.
Oh man, so we're on two completely different sides of the fence on this one.
Absolutely. I think this is a must win for Dan Hooker to keep any sort of top contendership hopes alive. And this is one of those learning experiences for Jalen Turner where he'll fight well for the first couple of minutes and then he'll get finished late in the first round and he'll have to go back to the drawing board. So
let's move on then, Zan, to the opening bout of the main card. So originally this was supposed to be Bo Nickal versus Tresean Gore in a fight I was very interested in. However, just a couple of days ago it was announced that Tresean Gore is injured and will not be able to compete. In stepping, Zan, Valentine, or just shortened to Val here, the Animal Woodburn, who is 7-0, has fought primarily for a promotion called Combat Night or Combat Night Pro, but has not fought since August of 2022.
yeah, this feels to me like a Joe Soto experiment. As just about 8 years later, this should be a very easy win for Bo Nickal. Don't be surprised if the night of the fight he's a -1,000 favorite. We don't have to spend too much time on this. Bo Nickal by first round submission. I'm going to say a minute 45 into the first round via arm triangle, and Val Woodburn is going to have to go back to the regional scene unless he fights just like Chris Moutinho fought against Sean O'Malley, gives him an absolutely amazing fight and makes his case to stick with the UFC for at least one more fight to give himself another opportunity. This is what this fight feels like to me, is an O'Malley versus Moutinho repeat just 2 years later.
A UFC, and the UFC wanted to give Bo Nickal a little step up with former tough competitor in Tresean Gore, but when that happened on such short notice, he pulled out. Oh, let's just make this another squash match, and that's all it is. And I'm not impressed with Val Woodburn's opponent history. Oh, by the way,
I'm not either.
He trains out at Fusion XL Performance, who has hosted the likes of Ronaldo Jacare Souza, Julian J. Smooth Williams, Mike Beast Boy Davis, Phil the Fresh Prince Rowe. But really, I just, like you said, this is just, the UFC taking advantage and trying to do another squash match, which, yeah, I assume Val Woodburn, maybe he'll get another fight as kind of a thank you, for doing this on such short notice, but most likely he goes back to the regional scene, and this is going to be, you know what? I know people shouldn't discredit Val Woodburn. I know MMA Mania is getting killed on social media right now for saying that the UFC dug up a warm body in Val Woodburn to face Bo Nickal, but it's one of those things where they're saying the quiet part loud. 1 round, first round submission, Bo Nickal.
For sure. And if Val Woodburn somehow wins, we need to be dead silent next week because we will have absolutely nothing to say.
If Val Woodburn beats Bo Nickal, then no, this is gonna be an interesting take. But if Val Woodburn upsets Bo Nickal, considering that his first fight, obviously you can say what you want about Jamie Pickett, but the fact that the fight ended, remember, actually the finishing combination started with a low blow. Mm-hmm. If Val Woodburn beats him here, I think we have to have questions about Bo Nickal and his transition into MMA.
I think so too, and it would be very reminiscent of when Joel Lozon beat Jens Pulver in 2006. That's how
it would be. Actually, Zan, I think it would be more reminiscent of Aaron Pico's debut with Bellator, when he made his debut with Bellator and he got finished at Madison Square Garden.
Oh, I remember that. Oh yeah.
So that's the main card. But Zan, as we are about to end hour 1, stretching into hour 2, let's go to the prelims. It's time to give a salute to one Robbie Lawler. So he's going to get inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame tonight as a result of his legendary second fight with Rory McDonald, their title fight at UFC 189, which, Zan, is my second favorite fight in mixed martial arts history. And then 2 nights later at UFC 290, he faces Nico Price in his swan song.
Yeah. First off, this is now, I guess we could say, UFE's own Nico Price, with him, of course, being a UFC fighter now. So shout out UFE, but it is no easy task when you are taking on the former UFC welterweight champion in Robbie Lawler. Again, as Tom alluded to, this is Robbie Lawler's retirement fight. And for those of you who are old enough to remember, I was not watching MMA at this particular point in time. But Robbie Lawler's UFC debut, just a small fun fact, UFC 37.5 at the Bellagio in 2002 did take place on the best damn sports show period on Fox Sports. And now 20 years later, his final fight will be taking place on ABC. I think it is a very fitting end to a career of a guy that's been everywhere, fought everyone, and done everything you could possibly do. And quite frankly, in my opinion, has the greatest comeback run to a UFC championship that I've ever seen in my entire life. Because when I met him in 2010, he was still in the midst of his Strikeforce run, and I don't think a lot of people really even remembered who he was at that point. And to see him where he is now, about 13 years later, it's good to see that he's still slugging it out with the best that the sport has to offer. And of course, Nico Price is one of these prospects that I think you and I have been high on for quite some time now. He's been in with the UFC a couple of years. This is without a doubt the biggest name he's ever fought. And this is one of those fights that is fight of the night written all over it. I don't see Robbie Lawler going into and ending his career off of a loss. I think he beats Nico Price here. I think he beats him in the second round. I think it'll be a very entertaining fight. It'll be a vintage Robbie Lawler performance. I think he'll win by TKO, and I think it'll be a cap end to what is a career that will always be remembered by his epic rematch with Rory McDonald at UFC 189 in 2015. And of course, I think it will also be a remembrance of just how revolutionary Robbie Lawler was, of being truly the first welterweight to have the power to knock other welterweights out. I think before he came into the UFC, we really didn't see it as much, and I think he was a guy who was almost not the inventor, so to speak, but someone who's a pioneer of that art of having welterweights go in and just slug it out. He was one of the first guys to do that, and I think it'll be a vintage Robbie Lawler performance.
First of all, Zain, I'll say in terms of the fight itself, I know Nico Price, you and I have basically covered and talked about for the last few years, whether at fan-sided or here. I just, he has had a lot of potential, but the fact that he can't seem to string wins together, he's coming off losses to, Zain, he's lost 4 of his last, he's lost 3 of his last 5. He lost to Philip Rowe in his most recent fight. He lost to Michel Pereira. He lost to Vicente Luque, which isn't a bad loss. But Zain, you go to that Cowboy Cerrone fight that he fought in 2020, and the fight was a draw because Price ended up, I think he got deducted for something. Yeah, it was repeated eye pokes. And then Zain, he fails a drug test and it becomes a no contest. So it's a rare situation where the fight counts for Cerrone, but not for him. And no disrespect to Cerrone, because Cerrone's going to the Hall of Fame just like Robbie Lawler is tonight. But 2020, Don Cerrone, if you can't get a win over him, that's not good. That's not good. And
it's not.
That sets it up, Zain, to the point where I understand the UFC's thing of trying to give somebody younger, because Nico's still only 33 compared to Robbie. Is giving a younger fighter a win, but I can't see, especially if Robbie Lawler can still pull out, because we've seen, Zain, some concerning performances from Robbie Lawler in recent years. You think back to, say, the fight with Colby Covington, where it just didn't seem like he could get anything going. But then you go back to his fight with Nick Diaz at UFC 266. Now, granted, Nick Diaz had been long out of the sport, but he could still put the beating on. And Brian Barberena, he lost that fight, Zain, but it was the fight of the night. So he can still pull out the vintage performances when possible. It's just a matter of, Robbie obviously has had the string of losses like we mentioned with Price. It would be sad if he lost to Nico Price and his swan song. But I just want to take the time right now to just think about the career of Robbie Lawler. And I always do this when fighters are retiring. But Zain, you made mention about making his debut with the best damn sports show, period. And Zain, that was back in 2002. Robbie Lawler was 20, maybe not even 20, maybe 19 years old. I mean, March of 1982, his UFC debut came May of 20. Okay, so he had just turned 20 at that point. That is how long he has been in this game. That is how long the UFC has known about him. I remember Zain, he and Nick Diaz fought at UFC 47. Like that, these guys have been around for ages. His first run with the UFC ends when the UFC is just starting to get out of its dark age period. He goes on and has a couple other fights. Pops up every now and again with, say, he made an appearance in IFL, he made an appearance in Pride, makes appearances for Elite XC, and becomes actually Elite XC's middleweight champion. I almost forgot. I don't think he became a Strikeforce champ. I know he challenged for the title, but I don't think he became.
He did. He was never a Strikeforce champion, contrary to what Dana White said in introducing him into the Hall of Fame on the Twitter video, which is still up, that the UFC was called out for. That was a factual error, because if you go back and look at his run fight by fight, he never legitimately challenged for a first title. But I guess if you say that he is a Strikeforce champion, it makes his resume look a little bit better. But nonetheless, yeah, I mean, we really didn't hear from him again from a UFC perspective until 2013, and that's when his whole run really started to take shape. Over the next several years, of course, his fights with Johnny Hendricks were legendary, and then without a doubt, the fight that's going to define his UFC run forever, long after he retires, long after he's gone, quite frankly, is going to be that rematch with Rory McDonald at UFC 189, which was quite a turning point in both of those guys' careers. Because if you think about it, Rory McDonald really was never the same again. It was when all the free agent talks started with Bellator, and then that was Robbie Lawler's second to last successful title defense before he fought Carlos Condit. So it's very interesting to see where those guys' careers kind of led them to. But I think that's the fight that's going to define his legacy when people look back, because that's one of the best, not just welterweight title fights ever, but one of the best title fights in UFC history.
Yeah, without a doubt. It's one of my favorite fights of all time, Zan. The two bloodied and battered each other. There was so much blood being spilled, so much blood on their faces. Robbie Lawler's lip was completely torn, and Rory put a beating on him, and he was 5 minutes away from winning the championship, and Robbie just unleashes this barrage, breaks Rory's nose, and gets the finish in unbelievable fashion. And Zan, we can't be remiss, though, if we don't mention that right after the Rory rematch, 6 months later, start of the new year, start 2016, he and Carlos Condit delivered a hell of a performance too. Some who feel that maybe Robbie shouldn't have gotten the nod in that fight.
Yep, exactly.
And obviously things weren't the same for Robbie after losing the championship to Tyron Woodley. But still, you think of the time spent that he has spent in this sport, and let alone the UFC. And you think of all the fights that he's had in that second run with the UFC en route to becoming the champion while he was the UFC welterweight champion. There is nothing like it in terms of not just quality, but in terms of just the longevity of the career. And I think
agreed. You won't see longevity like this from another former champion ever again, or let alone even close. Maybe the closest thing to it is John Jones, but even then, 20 years in this sport is a long time. I don't think in the era that he came up that guys of today's era can do what he was able to do, and I think it's going to be a long time before you see anything remotely close to that, if ever again.
Absolutely. So I won't lie. I'll say I am rooting for Robbie hard, so that way he can end his career on top.
You think he's going to win the fight?
I hope so. I really hope. I'm hoping he gets a decision win at least.
Yeah, I'm going to go the safe route and say Robbie gets a decision, but nonetheless, one of the classiest guys that I've ever met. And quite frankly, when I did ask him about the Nick Diaz fight at UFC 47, he said he literally said to me, quote, that he didn't even remember being in there with him. That's a long ago. Was funny. This is before like he became like the Robbie Lawler that we know him of today. This is back when he was kind of forgotten about and he was still in Strike Force. But that's a crazy story that I always tell people is that I saw him on a street corner in Indiana, and I think it was before his Melvin Manhoff fight, I'm pretty sure. And I asked him, oh, like, what do you think? Like how excited are you for your fight? He said, yeah, it's okay. I'm like, hey, just as an FYI, do you remember knocking out Nick Diaz at UFC 47? He's like, no, I actually don't. I'm like, oh, okay.
That's unreal. He is probably one of the most humble people. I talked to him a couple of years ago.
Super humble guy. Super humble.
Like I talk about his legendary run, and he talks about it like like it's nothing. Like it doesn't mean much in the long run. It's like like this dude is just the example of the most of humility that a fighter can display. He goes in, he does his business. The fans love him for it. It's a well-deserved spot in the Hall of Fame that he's getting tonight.
Oh, without a doubt. And he's just one of those fighters too, Tom, and I'm sure you can attest to this, where you remember where you were for every single one of those legendary fights that he was a part of, because he was must-see TV when he was at the top of the sport.
It was. I absolutely was. So my hats off go to Robbie Lawler. Obviously, we're saying that a little ahead of time. We still got the ceremony tonight with him and Rory. We've got the fight on Saturday. So let's enjoy these last experiences with Robbie Lawler as an active fighter.
Last weigh-in, too.
Last weigh-in. Yep. Other prelim fights, not too much. Jack Della Maddalena, obviously his original opponent fell out of short notice like Bo Nickel. So he's facing Josiah Harrell. The only fight, Zan, that really piques my interest on the prelims, other than Robbie and Nico, is this light heavyweight fight between Jimmy Crute and Alonzo Menefield.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is a fight that was run back very quickly, had a lot of controversy to it back in February, a fight that I actually thought Jimmy Crute won, quite frankly, and I thought he won it pretty fair and square. I don't know.
I thought that basically Jimmy Crute couldn't get the win, though, because Alonzo Menefield couldn't get the win because he got deducted the point in that fight.
Oh, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's right.
I'm glad at least we're going to get a conclusion to this fight.
We think we will.
I probably can fix it now.
But I'm taking Jimmy Crute by decision. With that said, although if Menefield keeps it standing, he could very realistically try to knock him out. Well, that'll be a fight, a very underrated fight to keep an eye on earlier in the card for sure.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you. I'm going to go Crute. I'm going to say by submission.
Okay.
We mentioned the Hall of Fame before, so you know what? Let's just talk about it now. UFC Hall of Fame class. The ceremony is going to be tonight. As long as you're listening or watching this on July 6th, if you're watching after that, it happened last night. Ceremony's on UFC Fight Pass. And Zan, I want to make mention of the Hall of Fame class because this is, without a doubt, the most stacked class that the UFC has ever had. And this is my favorite of the bunch, just because there are so many names and so many fan favorites in here. So how this Hall of Fame class is divided, for those who don't know. So we don't have a pioneer, we don't have a contributor wing inductee. We have two pioneer inductees in the legendary former middleweight champion Anderson Silva and the former inaugural lightweight champion in Jens Pulver. We have two modern era inductees, the former longtime popular UFC featherweight champion and WEC featherweight champion Jose Aldo, as well as his UFC WEC mate in probably one of the best, most legendary fighters to never win a major MMA championship, Donald Cowboy Cerrone. And the fight wing, we obviously made mention before, Robbie versus Rory 2. And then the Forrest Griffin Community Award for charity and service goes to Big Nog and Little Nog, the Nogueira brothers.
Yeah, I mean, this is a solid Hall of Fame class. It's a Hall of Fame class built for the hardcores. And I would just like to make mention this is our 45th episode of the MMA Outsiders. UFC 45 Revolution at the Mohegan Sun in 2003 was the 10-year anniversary of the UFC. This November will be the 30-year anniversary of the UFC. So I'd just like to make mention of that. The stars did align, and this week's episode is episode 45, and we have all of these celebrations coming up for the UFC and MMA as the year goes on. So I thought I'd like to tip my cap to, I guess, how the numbering system was able to work out there. But yeah, this Hall of Fame class is awesome. For some newer fans who don't know, Jens Pulver and like Tom said, the inaugural UFC lightweight champion fought all the way back in 2001. But I would say, would you say the rest of the names would be names that someone would know, in your opinion, if they just got into the sport a couple of years ago? Well, I think they're names that I think periodically pop up enough to where people should know who maybe just started getting into the sport maybe a couple years back.
I think so. I mean, Anderson Silva is a name that's been around for a long time and is very historic. Jose Aldo. I mean, Jose Aldo was still winning fights. Jose Aldo is still winning fights over in Shuto boxing. Jens Pulver, he's got a Twitch stream and he's got a following. Cowboy Cerrone, I mean, he was winning fights in 2019 and he is a legendary name, even though he never won a championship. So I think, Zain, maybe these names they're familiar in a historical sense, maybe not so much, captivating the hearts as they did, say, longer time fans like you or me or anybody else who got into the sport late noughts, early 2010s.
Exactly. But overall, great class. Be sure to tune in tonight on UFC Fight Pass for a very small subscription fee. It's worth it for the Hall of Fame ceremony, regional shows, and of course all the UFC docuseries that they do. And no, this is not a paid advertisement for UFC Fight Pass. This is just coming from someone who has been a subscriber since 2014 and has enjoyed the service greatly. So be sure to tune into the Hall of Fame ceremony if you have the time, either live on Thursday or immediately after Thursday night or Friday morning. It will definitely be a very, very noteworthy class of fighters, as it is every year around this time on International Fight Week. So be sure to tune in.
For sure. Couple other things to wrap up on with the UFC. Just to mention last week's card, UFC Vegas 76, main evented by Sean Strickland and Khabib Nurmagomedov. And, well, as we kind of expected, Sean Strickland's experience kind of made it no match for Khabib, and he was able to get a finish in the second round. I mean, I just really can't believe that this was the only fight the UFC was able to book as a main event for us.
Yeah, not much really more to add. Sean Strickland looked great. Abu's prospect to watch, but too early for a step up in competition like this. It'll be curious to see who the UFC gives him next, and I think it shut down Dana's narrative that no one wanted to fight Abu's, because that seemed like a very easy win for Strickland. And
Strickland, sorry, Zain, but it's Strickland in his promos for the main event said nobody wanted to fight him. Like, nobody would take the fight with Strickland, which I think is actually more believable.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that does sound a lot more believable, just considering who Sean Strickland has beaten over the last several years. But still, it just goes to show when the UFC puts on too many cards, you're going to get main events like that, and that's exactly what you got. But thankfully, from a card perspective, we did well on predictions. I went 9-3, you went 7-5. For a card that didn't get a ton of hype, the fights were actually good, and for once, we actually did well on predictions, which I don't know if it's one of those weird fluky weeks where we did very well on picks, but that's exactly what happened, and hopefully this newfound momentum continues into the mid to late summer and fall. But still, another one of those events where it's one that you kind of want to forget just because of what the main event was. But yeah, good performance for Strickland.
So this next story is very interesting, and it does involve one BJPenn.com, Zain. So we haven't talked about Ronda Rousey much on this show ever. However, her name is beginning to pop up. Now, she's been around with the WWE now. Obviously, she went there after her first UFC run ended. She's had a second run with the WWE that began at the start of 2022, won a women's title. Actually, was very recently women's tag team champions with one of her old buddies and another former MMA name in Shayna Baszler. And it seems like these two are going to have a match at SummerSlam in Detroit next month, which it's apparently, according to reports, going to be the fight that writes out Ronda Rousey from WWE. Because, as reported, Zan, the reporting comes from Wrestling Observer Radio, Dave Meltzer, who also has contributed to MMA fighting in the past, as well as, Zan, one Cole Shelton of your boys over at BJPenn.com, in which former UFC champion Ronda Rousey has reportedly informed the WWE of her soon-to-be departure. Let's see. These are the comments from Dave Meltzer. So apparently Ronda Rousey has informed the WWE of an exact date that she is hard out. She is done. And following Amanda Nunes' decision to hang up the gloves, UFC John Anik mentioned Ronda Rousey's name as a potential person to fight for the vacant title. Before you get off on that, anybody goes off on that, let me read the full quote from Dave Meltzer from the article. This was always, always, always the plan. It kept getting delayed, and then Ronda got hurt, and the thing was, and I don't know the date, and it might be SummerSlam, it might be a little bit after. The deal is that Ronda has a heart out. She gave a date. This is, quote, this is my last date. I remember talking to somebody there, and it's like, quote, I know they're going to do this, and I guess make the big match for WrestleMania. And it's like, no, her heart out is blank. They didn't give me the date, but it's long before WrestleMania. So that was the full quote. When I said quote, and when I was quoting, that was the whole quote within a quote thing. And many people are now wondering if Ronda is going to make somewhat of a comeback for the UFC. My take is that I don't see how that could be possible. Now, the first time she left the WWE was because she and Travis Brown were starting a family. This second time around, I mean, after being out of the sport for so long and going over to professional wrestling, I really don't know. We see some people go back and forth with the UFC and professional wrestling, or I should say mixed martial arts and professional wrestling. The biggest example in my mind right now, Zan, is Tom Lawler, who I think still competes on the regional scene, or at least did, while he was with New Japan Pro Wrestling and some of the other and some of the independent promotions around America. And obviously Brock Lesnar, but Brock Lesnar actually full on left the WWE before the UFC and left the UFC before making his WWE return. I don't know, Zan. I like Dave. I like Cole. I just can't buy this.
Yeah, and this isn't even a biased take, but I just don't see how a Ronda Rousey return to the UFC makes sense. I mean, she hasn't been in the UFC in 8 years. Unless the UFC doesn't think that who they currently have at 135 and cough cough 145 is marketable enough, then maybe this makes sense monetarily. But for her to step right into a title fight against a Juliana Pena or have a rematch with Holly Holm if she beats Bueno Silva next weekend, to me just doesn't make sense. Ronda Rousey is 36 years old. She's past her true prime in MMA. Lost to Amanda Nunes. We never got to see the Chris Cyborg fight. It was the chapter really closed on Ronda's career and her contributions? I'm not really sure. I think there's a lot of questions as to what she could have done had she not lost to Holly Holm. But at this point in her life and at this point in her athletic journey, to me, it doesn't make sense for her to come back. The only thing that would make sense for her to come back is because of monetary value and because the UFC needs her to come back.
I mean, like you said, it doesn't make sense for me because, when she went over to the WWE, Zan, she has been treated like a big star since. Now, obviously, she doesn't have the popularity as she did in her arrival the first time around. But, she's always seems to be in a title picture of some sort. She was always in the women's championship picture in her first run. She's constantly been in the women's championship picture in her second run. And if not in the women's championship, like I mentioned, she and Baszler were just the women's tag team champions. So they lost it, and they're going to have a big betrayal feud blow off next month at SummerSlam. But, like my point is she's always in a big match feel, and I'm sure WWE pays her very well. I don't, and obviously she has made her money when she was with the UFC. I don't understand why she would go back. And I definitely see it from the UFC's perspective of marketing and such. Obviously, Ronda was one of their big names in the past. Ronda brought the women's fighting over to the UFC. And you could argue, even though Amanda Nunes has long been the face of women's fighting and is the greatest women's fighter of all time, maybe she didn't have the marketability that Ronda had. Which then brings me to a little conspiracy theory I have. Listen, I'm going to say this. I do not believe in this. I don't think it would ever happen. I don't think it's possible. I'm still scratching my head at this even being a possibility, but since you brought up the fight, and since we're bringing up WWE, I will play a WWE clip here just to make the note that this is a conspiracy. C-O-N. Conspiracy? Just because I love our troop. Here's my conspiracy, Zain. We talked earlier about too many UFC cards, and we talked about pay-per-view plans and some pay-per-views getting screwed out, particularly when it came to Conor McGregor not fighting and thus making the UFC decide between November and December for, Madison Square Garden and T-Mobile respectively. And we've talked about Conor maybe getting a USADA exemption, which it doesn't seem like it's happened.
Okay.
Do you think the UFC and Dana White would be crazy enough to try and get one for Ronda, to try and book Ronda versus Holly Holm for December at T-Mobile?
Wow. I thought you were going to go one step further and say we were going to get John Jones, Conor McGregor, and Ronda Rousey all on UFC 300.
No, the UFC isn't that crazy. He is, but we remember what happened with the disaster that was UFC 200.
That's a good point.
But my whole thing is, I don't think it's actually going to happen. I think the UFC would be crazy, but it's like, are they crazy enough to the point where they would try that?
Anything's possible at this point. I mean, shoot, Tom, they have a Power Slap league for crying out loud, which is airing another event this Friday, in case you didn't know. But still, I'm not surprised with anything they do these days, because they realize that they can probably do whatever they want.
I mean, Zain, here's my take. I don't understand, especially, I should add to that, because I don't understand. She's been in professional wrestling for so long. She would have to go back to MMA, and that means training MMA, which means she needs a full camp and everything. But Zain, the one thing is, and the reason you're right in that and the reason I brought it up and I said the UFC could do, Zain,
the money.
You don't think that Ronda returning to UFC would bring all those purchases back? Like even if they book her for one fight, everyone's gonna. I shouldn't say everyone. People are gonna buy it.
Of course, it would feel like the UFC was back in 2015 again.
Right, and just to as much as Dana trash talks boxing, it would be in the spirit of competitive sports and boxing to do the rematch 7-8 years too late.
Of course.
So that's why I could see it happening.
I'm making a bold prediction. Screw it. I'm making a bold prediction right now. Ronda Rousey's going to come back. She's going to be thrust into a number one contender fight. She's going to somehow win that fight, and he's going to be the co-main event on UFC 300 to the main event of a Conor McGregor fight at UFC 300. The stars are aligning right now a year early. The wheels are in motion right now.
Somehow, I can't believe you are talking this. You are talking about this. I mean, Zan, I thought I was. But you know what? Dana is going to take that clip and he's just going to play it over and over and over again on a loop to try and make it happen. And even if he can't make it happen, he is going to dream of it.
So you're saying somehow that what I just said is going to go viral all over the internet. He's gonna take it and clip it over and over and over and over and over again.
No, loop it. Like he is going to loop it in the UFC office. He's going to do some sort of seance to try and make it happen.
Okay. Well, if that's true, well, if that somehow happens, then that means some special plans will have to be arranged so I could somehow be there.
Let's talk about Conor, by the way. So,
all right.
Conor, I should, by the way, point out, Conor has already deleted this tweet because, of course, he did. Of course, he did, Mr. Tweet and Delete. So, obviously, if you didn't watch episode 6 of Tough Enough, the Ultimate Fighter Aftermath, which Dan and I do every week after every Tough episode, go check that out. But obviously, this past Tough episode, Conor and Chandler had a little incident in the cage in which they chirped at each other. Conor shoved Chandler, and it looked like they were ready for the fight. We got the infamous Dana White running into the octagon. Out of my way, and tried to break up the fight. And basically, Chandler had earlier in the week. So the thing is, Conor was frustrated during the episode because Lee Hammond, who he is very close with, and the number one prospect, lightweight prospect, ends up getting submitted in comeback style by Kurt Holloway. And basically, Conor has a blow up. Both of them have a blow up. And the thing is, the ending to that episode got leaked earlier, like days earlier. And so Michael Chandler took to Twitter, basically talked about the leak, saying that they weren't sure if AI had done it or not, which we know now was kind of a fake way to try and blow some smoke off it and try to throw that thought in there. Maybe it was fake. But Chandler, as part of the comments, because he's pretty good with responding to replies from people in the MMA Twitterverse, and he said basically that Conor's a man of his word, and he doesn't expect that Conor would pull out because, Sam, we've talked about on recent weeks the possibility that Conor McGregor might not be interested in fighting Michael Chandler anymore.
Yes, we have. That's true.
But Conor, in a tweet prior to Tough episodes airing on the 4th of July, said he's ready for a fight. But again, Zan, it just wasn't win. It's already, we're halfway through this Tough episode. I mean, we're halfway through the season of Tough, and we still have no information about this fight.
No, we don't. And it leads me to believe that this fight is getting further and further away from happening. And then, of course, did you see that Jack Slack tried to stir the pot and say that
Yes,
Conor McGregor has agreed to fight?
Reading that while we were recording one of the segments, that apparently Jack Slack was tweeting that. Actually, I have it still up here. That Conor has agreed to fight Arman Sarukian because Chandler is, quote, trying too hard. Making Conor sound like he was in a relationship with Chandler. Oh, he tries too hard. He's really that cringe.
That also leads me to my next question of where does Kevin Lee fit into all of this?
Well, I don't know if he's anywhere after the performance he put on in his most recent fight in his UFC return.
No, probably not, unfortunately. But nonetheless, this is just another day of Conor McGregor being Conor McGregor again. And it's not news about when he's fighting next. It's news about other things that he's doing.
I get it. Conor's always the headline, but it's just, at this point now, Zan, I'll believe this fight happens when I see it. The more that we go with no word on a fight, the less likely I'm believing that this fight actually happens. And the more I believe that report from a couple weeks ago that he has no interest in fighting Chandler.
So you'll believe it when they step on the scale, or you'll believe it when they actually fight?
When they step on the scale.
Okay.
And again, Sam, it goes back to to the rant that I had at the end of the last Tough Enough, which Nick has already informed me that he wants to post everywhere. If McGregor has no interest in fighting Chandler, then do us all a favor and just retire for good.
You're not wrong in saying that, although it would kind of make me sad because I would really like to see him fight one more time. I think it'd be cool, but still, man,
I would as well. Just under, I mean,
I just want to see it.
Presenting such a good opportunity right here for this, and if Conor really has no interest, then like I said, then Tough is the biggest waste.
I just want to see Conor McGregor win. I'm sick of watching him.
I didn't say that. I just want to give him the chance to compete again.
No, I know, but I'm saying personally that I want to see Conor McGregor win another fight before he actually retires.
Maybe it's all just a dream, Zain. Maybe it's life is just a dream. One more MMA story before we go to a few boxing stories to end things off, Zain. We have an exclusive from you for BJ Penn.
Yeah,
so explain this.
Yeah, so thanks to TalkSport and another outlet, and also thank you to all of the other MMA sites who didn't cover this, but we now know the final reason, because of yours truly, as to why Khabib Nurmagomedov retired from the sport of MMA. And it was because Dana White was doing all he could to ensure that there was a possibility of Nurmagomedov versus McGregor 2 in early 2021. But after USADA kept testing him over and over and over again, Khabib said, I have enough. I want to retire. The division needs to move on. And again, it all stems from, his family telling him to no longer compete. So now we know the real reason why Khabib retired. It was not just because of his family. That was one layer to it, but it was because he was sick of USADA coming to his house and asking him to do his business, if you will, in that room.
So Zain, just going off of that story that you just reiterated here and what you did for BJ Penn, do you honestly think that if there was the possibility, if there was the guarantee, let me actually change the word, if there was the guarantee that Nurmagomedov McGregor 2 would happen, he wouldn't have retired against Gaethje, and he would have done one more fight just to do that fight and then retire?
That would be my guess. Javier Mendez didn't say that explicitly, but he did say that Dana White was partially the reason why Khabib was still sticking around, because Dana was keeping him in the USADA pool, thinking that he would fight, and he never ended up fighting again.
So let me bring to now the other part of this, USADA, because Khabib is not the first person to complain about USADA. Now, granted, we've seen the changes that USADA has made in the sport since they came around almost a decade ago. But we've also seen, and people like Felder, Cormier, definitely Cormier, several other fighters have talked about their experiences with USADA where, I mean, Zain, there's footage of Demetrius Johnson getting tested by USADA in the middle of a Twitch stream that he did.
I remember that. What was that, 2017? Probably?
Yeah, something like that. So, what are your thoughts about USADA and what they've done with the sport and their, let's call it, practices?
I mean, I think they've cleaned it up for the most part, but I think also when you've got the Golden Snitch running things over at the UFC, when you got Mr. Nowinski calling the shots, you're going to get some special treatment, and that's exactly what's happened. And they talk about wanting to clean up the sport. Then my question is, why was an entire UFC event moved from Las Vegas to California? Because you guys wanted to save the event. Number two, why are all of these massive stars getting exemptions when if you're not a massive star, you'd be told to go sit in the corner and mind your business? I think it's all kind of counterintuitive. And I think Khabib didn't want to be a part of that narrative of being someone who was sucked into the demands of USADA. This is just my personal opinion, and it seems like Javier Mendez felt this way too, to where if he was sucked into it, he would have been forced to do what USADA told him. So Khabib would just stand his ground and say, "No, I'm not gonna be a part of this."
Yeah, Zain, the first thing I think of about Golden Snitch and the special treatment and everything is the UFC at the end of 2018. I think it was 232, where they move it from Nevada to California on about a week, if not even less notice, just because of John Jones.
5 days.
5 days notice. 5 days notice. Like nobody, they would do that for John. They would do that for Conor. I don't think they would do that for anybody else.
They could maybe do it for Khabib.
Maybe Khabib, but still, Khabib is still getting tested, and he's still all the conditions of USADA. You know, sometimes it's late in the middle of the night or very, very early in the morning, and he's just had it. And honestly, I don't blame him. Now, granted, USADA, you're right, it has cleaned up the sport for the most part, but there is still hypocrisy that can go around. Although some of it stretches over to the athletic commissions, but I don't want to get us on a whole nother rant about the athletic commissions again.
100%. But yeah, there's your breaking news for me, I guess, this week. Maybe I'll make this a weekly thing. We'll see what other nuggets I come up with. But again, let me just plug it one more time. He plugged it earlier in the show. I am a staff writer for bjpenn.com. Shout out to Cole Shelton for his tremendous reporting. Shout out to Josh Evanoff and my entire team over at bjpenn.com. We are all workhorses in our own right. So it's cool to see that we've been highlighting my outlet for the majority of the episode, and keep it locked in because we'll have more MMA news on our side, and I know Tom will for fan side as well. So it's nice to see outlet. It's helping other outlets out. I think it's great, and yeah, there's your breaking news for me this week. Khabib Nurmagomedov had enough of USADA, and that is why he decided to retire and relinquish his weight title. Hence why Khabib Nurmagomedov retired at 29-0 and not the coveted 30-0 that Dana really wanted him to pursue, which he obviously never did.
Let's move over, Zain, quickly. Let's go into a few boxing stories now. So, an update to a story we talked about last week. Canelo is going to fight in September, defend his undisputed super middleweight title. It will, however, not come against Jermell Charlo. Jermell Charlo is out due to what is being called personal reasons. And instead, Canelo will now fight the other Charlo, Jermell Charlo, in a fight of undisputed champion versus undisputed champion that will take place September 30th, not 16th, at the T-Mobile Arena. So they actually pushed it back a couple of weeks to ensure that they would get T-Mobile and not settle for something like MGM Grand.
Yeah, I'm glad that Canelo is still getting a September fight, but I can totally understand the boxing community's disappointment in this because September 16th, Mexican Independence Day weekend, has always been reserved for a major Canelo fight. And again, like I just alluded to, I totally understand where the boxing community is coming from. Why is the UFC overtaking our weekend that's always reserved for Canelo, et cetera, et cetera? That's another discussion for another episode. But glad to see the fight is still happening. Glad to see it is against Charlo. Glad to see it is still in Vegas, and glad to see that Canelo is going to get the spotlight as the main attraction that night with no major UFC that weekend.
The only thing, Zain, is that I kind of feel bad because we actually made mention of it last week. Jermell Charlo could have maybe fought. I mean, there was a whole thing about him and Tim Tszyu fighting for Jermell Charlo. Jermell Charlo, I should mention, is the undisputed light middleweight champion, not super middleweight. So Jermell Charlo was going to defend against Tim Tszyu. They had a whole thing where the fight had been postponed, but now Jermell is going to step up and take on Canelo. You kind of feel bad for Tim Tszyu, and it's brought about a question about what do you do with Jermell Charlo, and the WBO has actually come out and basically insinuated they're going to have a discussion about the future of the title. And, you know, the WBO now reports are saying, actually, let me double check to see who is doing the reporting on it, but there's a report that the WBO may take away the undisputed versus undisputed, marketing slogan that's being built up for the title fight early because they might strip Jermell of the WBO light middleweight title.
Very interesting.
Yeah, here it is from Boxing Scene, actually a couple of days ago. WBO meeting next week to rule on 140-pound 140-pound title and Jermell Charlo's 154-pound title status.
Yeah, I don't see that going well if you're Charlo fan and you're rooting for the undisputed versus undisputed tag. Knowing the WBO and what they've done over the last several years, that's not gonna go over well in my opinion.
No, I certainly foresee Jermell getting stripped unless, and that's gonna. I mean, if you're premier boxing champions, you better pray, you better advocate for whatever to get that undisputed tag in there, because I don't see the WBO, Zan, is one of those of the four major sanctioning bodies. Them and the WBC, I'd say, are the ones who are very quick to pull the trigger on stripping championships.
Yep.
I would say the WBO even more, especially than the WBC. So
I would agree, and you could probably argue that the WBA years ago held that title, but now I would say the WBO. Yeah, for sure.
So I could definitely see them stripping him and then running Sue versus who was the last guy? So Jermell had the 2 fights with Brian Castano. You very well could see something like Sue versus Castano for the vacant WBO title at that point.
Yep.
And Jermell Charlo, personal reasons keeping him out. Zan, Jermell hasn't fought since 2021.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that has also brought about some speculation. This one there's no reports on, but Jermell Charlo is the WBC middleweight champion. Actually, he hasn't fought. Yes, June of 2021, the decision against Juan Montiel. So now there's brought about some thoughts about, he hasn't fought in 2 years, and now he just pulled out a big fight. If you're the WBC, do you strip him of the middleweight title?
I could easily see it. Also, fun fact, the fight against Montiel is the last major boxing match that I covered in my time at Fansided, and one of the best boxing matches that I've ever seen in my entire life. So just a little fun fact, and a fight recap that I'm personally very proud of just because of how awesome the fight was.
So you would have to hope all is well with Jermell Charlo, but we talk about just with the UFC, let alone just boxing, the moving on with divisions. At some point, the WBC has to say we have to move on, right?
Yeah, and I don't think they should delay this any longer. They need to make a decision at least before September 1st, in my opinion.
Which actually also leads into this story here. So Tyson Fury, Francis Ngannou. We don't have any, full-on dates yet. We've talked about Deontay Wilder possibly doing a 2-fight series with Francis Ngannou, one in boxing and then the other as a PFL main event. Eddie Hearn, however, in the last week has done an interview where he claims that Tyson Fury versus Francis Ngannou, I want to say that was with, I think it's Fight Hub TV. They do a lot of the video interviews with YouTube for boxing.
Yeah, Fight Hub is the big one, as well as ES News too. ES News is another
it was
big
one of those two. But Fury, he says that Ngannou is going to do Fury. That Fury, which I know Ngannou has talked about wanting, Tyson Fury, the WBC and lineal heavyweight champ. Hearn says he wants that to happen. That that potential fight is in negotiations, but it would be an exhibition bout.
Yeah, that's very interesting, but I guess it makes sense just considering how much limited experience, and quite frankly, limited boxing or none at all experience or non-experience that Francis Ngannou has. And if you just want to make the fight happen any which way you want, I think exhibition is the right way to go. And Eddie Hearn is the promoter. I've always been a fan of his. I'm all for him making that exhibition happen, and to his credit, I hope it does, and I hope he is the guy to make it happen.
It's actually funny that you bring up Eddie Hearn, and we talk about him and Deontay Wilder, because Eddie Hearn is actually also responsible for news that relates to our last story here for this episode. So Deontay Wilder, after all that we talked about with the PFL and Francis Ngannou, now looking at potential bouts with Andy Ruiz Jr. and Anthony Joshua. So these are two legitimate sources here. So Deontay Wilder, Andy Ruiz Jr., that's been long rumored ever since both were under PBC. Ruiz had just shocked Anthony Joshua at the Garden to become the heavyweight champ. Deontay had the WBC title. Obviously, there was all the talk maybe they could do the unification bout. But of course, Anthony Joshua activated the rematch clause and beat Ruiz in Saudi Arabia to recapture the other 3 heavyweight championships, and Wilder ended up losing to Tyson Fury. But they still want to somehow make the fight happen. However, Andy Ruiz Sr., the father of Andy Ruiz, told ESPN Deportes in the last week that apparently negotiations have not been going well, that Deontay Wilder wants a 70-30 per split in his favor. Ruiz wants 50-50. And so Wilder is now potentially also eyeing a fight with Anthony Joshua, which, according to Eddie Hearn, in an interview with of all people, Zan, I can't believe he has a a media outlet.
Derek Chisora.
Yeah, Derek Chisora. I can't believe he has a media outlet, but we saw the footage on his Instagram. It's him with a microphone interviewing Eddie Hearn. It's not AI thing, and Eddie says they are looking at negotiations with Saudi Arabia, trying to get the fight to happen before the end of the year.
That is so crazy. And this is also a fight, I might add, that Dana White wanted to see all the way back in 2018, and we're still talking.
What did we talk about with boxing? That 5, 6, 7 years too late, they make the matches.
I know.
One of these two fights could have been an undisputed heavyweight title fight, but no.
Oh, no, of course not. Boxing gets in its own way again, and there's no major boxing this weekend.
No, but it's like if you're Deontay, you've got this, and you've got the potential of this. So what the hell is Wilder do? What does Wilder want? That is my question at this point. What does he want?
We don't know, but we do know that he is one of the baddest dudes on the planet, considering that 41 of his 42 wins are a knockout. So regardless of who he fights, it's going to be very entertaining. So
the irony that the one time he didn't get a knockout was the one that when he beat Strickland for the WBC heavyweight title.
Absurd.
It's absolutely insane. But yeah, I just want to see Deontay Wilder in the ring again at this point.
Oh, I think every boxing fan, casual or not, absolutely does, for sure. That's going to wrap it up for episode 45 of the MMA Outsiders. Before we get out of here, be sure to like and subscribe. Be sure to share the show everywhere across social media. Be sure to share the show across, of course, all the Empty the Bench podcast network platforms, including our very own at MMA Outsiders ETB, at ETB Network, at ETB Sports. You know the drill. Like, share, comment, retweet, follow. Be sure to follow me at Bando99. Again, I'm a staff writer for BJPen.com, as well as a member of the Bellator rankings panel. It's me and 23 other media members. So if you need someone to complain about the rankings to, you can come to me or the other 23 of us, and I'm sure we can give our justifications as to why the rankings are that they are, although it is up to Bellator to make those final decisions. And of course, as you know, I'm a staff writer for BJPen.com and have been since August of last year. To my left is Tom Albano. He's a contributor for Fansided MMA, and he's doing phenomenal work for the PFL website. He will be on duty for PFL Europe, as well as UFC 290 and all of the other happenings in combat sports. He is definitely a go-to source there.
I'm going to need plenty of this weekend.
Yeah, you're going to need plenty of water because you're going to be doing a lot of screaming, I'm sure, a lot of pacing back and forth, and definitely.
And I'll just be up for hours and hours covering fights.
Yeah, and you're probably going to need a couple Mountain Dews in there. You're going to need to warm your fingers up to get ready for the keyboard. You're going to be very, very busy.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's going to do it for us. Actually, one other story, Zan, just to make mention of.
Okay.
Really silly thing. Remember we talked about the BMF title?
Yeah.
And we were like, why is this thing back? And we said, like, Masvidal was the champ and everything. Apparently, he says, I love that the UFC is bringing back the title for Poirier Gaethje. So there you go. The original BMF has put the blessing there.
That is awesome. And speaking of other titles, I agree with all of the people across MMA social media that say that the interim title should be silver to distinguish the undisputed and interim titles. It only makes sense to keep it uniform that way. If you keep it gold, it's way too confusing. I had to throw that in before we get out of here. And of course,
but that means, but you know what? That's opening up that the UFC will become like the WBA. So how the WBA has the gold championship, we'll have gold for the original, silver will be, and then we're gonna have the UFC bronze championship for every division.
Oh, come on. It's just going to have to be more stuff to memorize that I don't have time to memorize. Nonetheless, before we get out of here, we thank you guys so much for tuning in. We know that this episode was on the longer side, so thank you guys for bearing with us. Again, as we always say, the combat sports scene literally has no off-season. News can break at any time. So thank you again for sticking with us. We hope you enjoyed the fights this weekend and all of the happenings that is UFC 290 in Las Vegas. And of course, before we get out of here, as we always like to say on this flagship program, be Joe Pyfer.
Be Joe Pyfer. Stay tuned to our social media, by the way. We might be around Sunday morning or afternoon for a little post-show stream for UFC 290.
Yeah, for those of you who don't remember, we try to do these post-show streams for major pay-per-views, and based on Tom and I's criteria that we have developed ourselves, we believe that UFC 290 fits that description. So again, as he said, stay tuned to our social media at MMA Outsiders ETB for all the goodies of if and when we will be doing that post Sunday after stream of recapping UFC 290.
So until then, guys, that's Zain. I'm Tom. Take care. We'll see you next time.
Take care. Have a good one, everyone. Enjoy the fights.